Why did humans invent marriage? It is a question that feels like it should have a simple, romantic answer, but history is rarely that kind. About 85% of recorded human societies have allowed a man to have more than one wife. This is a flat, historical reality that sits uncomfortably alongside our modern ideas of the one. When you look at the broad sweep of human existence, our current version of a two-person, love-based union is actually the outlier. So, what was the original purpose? Was it a biological necessity to keep babies alive, or was it a cold, calculated piece of social engineering? If marriage wasn't born out of love, then what was the actual spark that made us sign the first contracts? To find the beginning of this story, we have to look back much further than the first white dress or the first gold ring. We have to look at the unique and difficult way humans grow up. In the 1980s, anthropologists like Hilliard Kaplan began looking at the human life history model. He noted something fascinating. Humans are unique because we have extremely long childhoods where we consume far more calories than we produce. A human child is a massive energy sink for nearly 20 years. In most other primate species, the mother can manage the caloric needs of her offspring on her own. But for humans, the math simply doesn't add up. A mother struggling to find calorie-dense food while carrying a vulnerable infant needs help. Kaplan argued that this created a massive evolutionary pressure for a stable, long-term partnership where a male provides high-quality food, like meat, in exchange for the female's reproductive certainty. It sounds like a cold trade, doesn't it? But is it possible that our deepest emotions were originally just a way to balance a survival budget? This idea of the provisioning father is one of the most famous theories in anthropology, but it isn't the only one. Other researchers, like Sarah Blaffer HRDY, have pointed out that humans are cooperative breeders. In her 2009 book, Mothers and Others, HRDY argues that marriage wasn't just about one man and one woman. It was about creating a network of alloparents, grandmothers, aunts, and siblings, who all helped raise the child. In this view, marriage was the formal anchor of that network. It wasn't just a bond between two people. It was a way to ensure that a child had an entire team committed to their survival. But if we were already living in cooperative groups, why did we need a specific formal rule about who belonged to whom? Why did we feel the need to turn a natural urge into a legal obligation? The answer might lie in a shift that happened thousands of years after we first started walking upright. For a long time, humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. In these small groups, things were relatively fluid. But then we invented the plow. About 10,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution changed the human story forever. Suddenly, people owned things. They owned land, they owned grain, and they owned livestock. And once you own something, you start to worry about who gets it when you're gone. This is where marriage transformed from a survival strategy into an economic tool. If a man was going to spend his life tilling a field and building a granary, he wanted to be absolutely certain that the children inheriting that wealth were his. Is it possible that the white picket fence was built specifically to keep people out, rather than to keep a family in? This shift toward property led to one of the most mysterious periods in human history. In 2015, a geneticist named Monica Carmen led a massive study published in Nature Communications that analyzed the Y chromosomes of men from all over the world. They found something shocking. Around 7,000 years ago, there was a massive bottleneck in the male population. For every 17 women who reproduced, only one man did. This wasn't because of a plague or a war that only killed men. It was likely because of the way marriage and social structures changed with agriculture. Wealthy, powerful men were able to monopolize almost all the women in a society, leaving the majority of men with no chance to pass on their genes. This era of extreme polygyny, one man with many wives, was the dominant reality for thousands of years. But if that was the natural result of wealth and power, why did we eventually move toward a system where every man is supposed to have just one wife? This brings us to the diplomatic theory of marriage, famously championed by Claude Lévi-Strauss in 1949. He argued that marriage was never really about the people getting married. It was an exchange between groups. In many ancient societies, families would trade their daughters to other tribes to create an alliance. It was a way to turn a potential enemy into an in-law. If your daughter is living in the next village, you are much less likely to raid that village. Levi Strauss saw women as the ultimate gift that allowed human societies to cooperate on a massive scale. It is a deeply uncomfortable way to view history, seeing human beings as pieces of ancient diplomacy. But if marriage was just a treaty, how did it become so heavily regulated by the law? And why did the rules become so incredibly specific? Long before the modern wedding, we see the first legal footprints of marriage in the ancient Near East. Many people point to the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE, but we actually have even older records. The Code of Uar-Nammu, which dates back to roughly 2100 BC in Sumer, already had specific laws about marriage and divorce. These weren't about love or religion. They were about money. One law states that if a man divorces his first wife, he has to pay her a specific amount of silver. If he divorces a woman who was previously a widow, the payment is less. Marriage was a civil contract, more like a business merger than a sacred right. It protected property, it ensured the legitimacy of heirs, and it gave the state a way to track who belonged to whom. But if marriage was just a contract, why did the church and the state spend so much energy trying to make it sacred? For much of history, the sanctity of marriage was a secondary concern. In ancient Greece, marriage was almost entirely about oikos, the household. A father would hand his daughter to a husband with the words, "I give you this woman for the plowing of legitimate children." That was the goal. Romance was something you found elsewhere, in friendships, in philosophy, or in extramarital affairs. The idea that your spouse should also be your best friend and your soulmate would have seemed absurd to an ancient Athenian. They saw marriage as a duty to the city and the family line. But if marriage was a duty, what happened when people stopped wanting to do it? How did the leaders of the world convince millions of people to follow a single, strict path of monogamy? This is where the work of Joseph Henrich becomes vital. In his 2012 study, The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage, he looked at why the West eventually shifted away from the polygyny that had been the human norm for so long. His conclusion wasn't about morality, it was about math. When a few wealthy men have all the wives, you end up with a large population of young, low-status men with no stake in the future. These men have nothing to lose, which leads to high rates of violence, rape, and theft. Henrich argued that societies that enforced monogamy were actually democratizing the mating market. By giving every man a chance to have a wife and a family, these societies became much more stable and peaceful. They were able to outcompete the more chaotic, polygynous societies around them. Monogamy wasn't a gift to women, it was a bribe to men to keep them from burning society down. Does it change how you see your own relationship to realize it might be a tool for social pacification? While monogamy was spreading as a legal norm, the concept of love was still mostly absent from the equation. Historian Stephanie Kuntz, in her book Marriage, A History, points out that for thousands of years, marrying for love was actually considered a threat to social order. If you could just choose your spouse based on how you felt, how could your parents use you to make a political alliance? How could the community ensure that property stayed in the right hands? In many cultures, love was seen as a kind of temporary insanity that would eventually fade, leaving a marriage in ruins. It wasn't until the Enlightenment in the 18th century that the idea of individual happiness started to outweigh the needs of the group. As the Industrial Revolution took hold, young people started moving to cities and earning their own wages. They no longer needed their parents' permission or their family's land to survive. For the first time in human history, they were free to choose. But is freedom actually what made marriage better, or did it just make it more fragile? This shift toward the companionate marriage transformed the institution into what we recognize today. We began to expect our partners to be everything: lovers, friends, co-parents, and financial partners. It is a massive burden to place on a single relationship. We are asking one person to fulfill needs that used to be met by an entire village. And yet, we cling to it. Even as divorce rates climbed in the 20th century, the cultural obsession with the perfect wedding only grew. We have taken an ancient survival technology designed for calorie sharing and property tracking and tried to turn it into a vessel for our highest emotional aspirations. Is it possible that the reason marriage feels so hard today is because we are asking it to do something it was never designed to do? To understand just how much of a technology marriage is, we can look at the rare cultures that chose a different path. The Masuo people in China are a famous example. They practice what is called walking marriage. There is no formal contract, no shared property, and no lived-in household. A man visits a woman at night and leaves in the morning. Any children born from the union stay with the mother's family and are raised by her brothers. The Masuo have no word for husband or father in the way we use them. For them, the family is built on blood, not on a contract. This system has worked for centuries, proving that marriage, as we know it, isn't the only way to organize a society. But the Masuo are an exception that proves the rule. Most societies, when faced with the chaos of life, chose the contract. They chose the rules. They chose to trade their freedom for a bit of stability. Why did we choose the cage over the open field? As we move further into the 21st century, the definition of marriage continues to shift. We have seen the legalization of same-sex marriage, a move that finally detached the institution from its ancient plowing of children, roots, and anchored it firmly in the soil of civil rights and emotional commitment. We are seeing more people choose to live together without any contract at all, or to explore ethical non-monogamy. It feels like we are deconstructing the machine, piece by piece. But even as we tear it down, the ghost of the old system remains. We still use the language of permanence and commitment. We still crave the public witness of our private feelings. We are still the same primates who needed a team to raise a child and a treaty to stop a war. Can we ever truly move past a tool that is so deeply woven into our DNA? When you look at the wedding ring on someone's finger, you aren't looking at a symbol of an eternal soulmate. You're looking at a fossil. You are looking at the remnants of a calorie-sharing agreement, a peace treaty between warring tribes, a property deed for a plot of land, and a social bribe to keep young men from being violent. It is a dense, heavy object made of thousands of years of human struggle. We have wrapped it in white silk and covered it in flowers to make it look beautiful, but underneath the lace, the iron is still there. Marriage was the first great invention of human civilization, the one that allowed us to build everything else. It gave us the stability to turn from wandering animals into builders of empires. But empires always have a cost. Does the modern version of marriage still serve us, or are we just maintaining a monument to a world that no longer exists? The story of marriage is not a story of a slow march toward romance. It is a story of a species trying to survive in a world that was constantly trying to kill it. We used marriage to bind ourselves to each other when the cold and the hunger were too much to bear alone. We used it to make sure our children survived and our land stayed ours. We turned a biological urge into a social cage, and for a long time, that cage kept us safe. Now that we are safe, now that we have the luxury of choice, we find ourselves looking through the bars and wondering if we were ever meant to be inside at all. We are the first generations in history to try and build a marriage on nothing but love. It is a beautiful experiment, but it is also a terrifying one. Without the pressure of the tribe, the law, and the land holding us together, will the bond hold? Think about the way we talk about marriage today. We call it the big day, or the final step. We treat it like the end of a story, the happily ever after. But for our ancestors, it was the beginning of the work. It was the start of the struggle. They didn't expect to be happy, they expected to be successful. They expected to endure. We have flipped the script, making happiness the goal and endurance the burden. And in doing so, we have made marriage more meaningful than ever before, but also more precarious. We are standing on the shoulders of millions of people who married for reasons we would find horrific, just so that we could have the chance to marry for a reason they would find ridiculous. Is that progress, or is it just a different kind of trap? As we look toward the future, the question of why we invented marriage becomes even more pressing. In a world where we can raise children alone, where wealth is digital, and where our tribe is a global network, do we still need the contract? Or will we eventually return to the fluidity of our hunter-gatherer past, where bonds were made of shadow and breath rather than ink and stone. The data suggests we are already moving in that direction, with marriage rates in the West hitting historic lows. We are testing the limits of how much of the old machine we can throw away before the whole thing collapses. And yet, even the most cynical among us still feel the pull of that ancient ceremony. We still want to stand before our community and say, "This one is mine." The invention of marriage was the moment humans decided that nature wasn't enough. We decided that the random, messy feelings of the heart couldn't be trusted to build a civilization. We needed something harder. Something that would last longer than a season. We needed a way to turn me into us and ours into theirs. We built it out of necessity, out of greed, and out of fear. We polished it with religion and tradition until it shone. And now, we are left holding this ancient, heavy thing, trying to remember what it was for. Was it ever really about the two people at the center of the frame? Or were they just the fuel for a much larger fire? Every time a couple stands at an altar, they are reenacting a ritual that has been performed in mud huts, in stone temples, and in plastic-seated courthouses for millennia. They are stepping into a structure that was built by people who are long dead, for reasons that have mostly been forgotten. They are promising to stay in a cage that was originally designed to protect them from a world that no longer exists. It is a beautiful, tragic, and deeply human act of defiance. We are trying to make a permanent thing in a world that is defined by change. We are trying to make a sacred thing out of a business deal. And perhaps that is the ultimate answer to why we invented it. We didn't invent marriage because it was natural. We invented it because it was impossible. But we have to be honest about what that impossibility cost. For every alliance made, a person was traded like a commodity. For every inheritance secured, a woman was confined to a household. For every social peace maintained by monogamy, 1,000 hearts were forced into a shape they didn't fit. We have spent thousands of years trying to tame the human spirit with a piece of paper and a golden loop. We have used it to build cities and to break spirits. It is the most powerful tool in our history, and like any tool, it has left scars. As we look at the rings on our fingers, we should remember that they aren't just jewelry. They are the latest version of a chain that stretches back to the dawn of our species. If you could sit across from an ancestor who lived 5,000 years ago and explain our version of marriage, they wouldn't feel inspired. They would feel terrified. To them, the idea of a marriage based on nothing but the shifting sands of human emotion would look like madness. They would ask you who was going to protect the land. They would ask you how you would know who your brothers were. They would see our freedom as a dangerous, lonely void. It makes you wonder, who is actually right? Have we finally perfected the institution, or have we accidentally stripped away everything that actually made it work? Tell me in the comments. If the legal and economic reasons for marriage completely vanished tomorrow, do you think people would still do it, or is the "I do" just a habit we haven't learned how to break? We like to think that we have outgrown the cold, calculated origins of our ancestors. We tell ourselves that we have turned a survival strategy into a love story. But the laws are still on the books, the property is still being divided, and the social stability is still being maintained by the norms we follow. We are still living in the house that our ancestors built, even if we have repainted the walls and changed the furniture. The structure remains. The cage is still there, even if we've left the door standing open. We are the architects of our own confinement, and we continue to build the walls higher every time we walk down the aisle. We didn't invent marriage to protect love. We invented it to protect ourselves from each other. The contract is signed and the gavel has fallen.